Hello and welcome to another episode of Enter the Boardroom with NewRole. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of NewRole, the board search specialist and market leader bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today's guest, Professor Isabel Fernandez-Mateo, a professor of strategy and entrepreneurship at London Business School, where she holds the Adecco Chair, holding a PhD in management from MIT. Professor Fernandez-Mateo is an expert on how relationships influence career outcomes, particularly in hiring, job transitions, and career advancement. She also studies gender diversity in the labour market. In her recent work, she examines the organisational and social barriers that prevent women's access to positions of leadership. She's been published in leading academic journals such as Administrative Science Quarterly, American Sociological Review, and American Journal of Sociology, Management Science and Organisation Science. Isabel, a huge welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I am very happy to be here with you today.
Isabel, we first met because of your work that I came across on rejections, which are a massive area of focus for us at NewRole, because ensuring that we do a really good job of rejecting unsuccessful candidates is critical to us to ensure that they continue to be available for future roles. What have you learned about rejections that you can share with us that those involved with board hiring processes should be aware of?
Yes. So look, I have been doing research on hiring for almost 25 years now. And around 10 years ago or so, I was looking into how executive search firms recruit top management and board members. And I was talking with a lot of search consultants, and I kept hearing that their hardest job was dealing with rejection. So both candidates turning down jobs and companies turning down candidates. They kept telling me that they had to work very hard to make sure that these rejections did not mess up future relationships because people took them very seriously. But the interesting thing is that back then, most hiring research was all about who gets hired, but there was no focus on what happens when someone does not get hired, either because they were rejected or because they reject a job. So I saw a big gap there and I decided to explore it myself. And what have I learned over the years? I think that most people who are involved in hiring understand that candidates don't feel great about being rejected and that companies are not thrilled when candidates turn them down either. What is always not appreciated is that these rejections can impact future relationships in a big way. For example, in one of my studies, I used data from more than 10,000 executives that were being considered for top management and board roles by an executive search firm. And I found that those who had been previously rejected were 25% more likely to turn down an interview for another job later on than those who had not been rejected. Interestingly, I also found that candidates who had been rejected before and were later reconsidered for jobs were more likely to get interviews for positions that were a better fit and that were also more likely to get hired for those jobs. While rejection had a negative emotional impact on people, it also can have a very positive learning effect. So I guess that the point is that the recruitment process, we know that it's not just a straightforward, logical matching game, but that emotions, learning experiences, and relationships play a huge role, and they can have a significant economic impact.
Are there specific gender or ethnic or other demographic differences that you observe?
So I could not observe ethnic differences because I did not have data on that. I did have data on gender, and I found that these effects of rejection were actually stronger for women. So even for all candidates, they are less likely to engage with a firm that previously rejected them, but this was more so for women candidates. And I did quite a lot of research on why this might be. And what I found was this is not because women are more quote unquote sensitive to rejection or they are more risk averse, but this was because their prior experiences make them more attuned to the fairness of the process. So therefore, if you are committed to increasing diversity in your hires, you need to be very mindful of how you handle rejections because these do not affect everybody in the same way, so to speak. Yes, there were gender differences.
So what are the implications that you see for those involved with board hiring processes and the way that they reject candidates?
An important way of thinking about this is that although people react negatively to rejection, this is not uniformly. There are ways of managing the rejection process that might make it a little bit less negative, so to speak. You can mitigate these negative effects in a couple of ways. So first, it is important to set clear expectations for candidates about their chances of success. Really, no one likes feeling like they are a filler candidate who was never seriously considered. So you have to be very clear about that. And second, but probably even more important, is to provide candidates with very clear and plausible reasons for their a rejection. When they receive a good explanation, they are more likely to use that feedback to learn and improve rather than have a negative reaction. And this seems very obvious, but I'm often surprised by how many recruiters skip this step. They either don't explain why the candidate didn't get the job, or they give reasons that seem vague, insincere, and people don't believe them. So while this might sound like obvious advice, it's actually surprisingly underused in my experience.
I often encourage people to maximize their luck surface area by, if you engage intelligently with enough roles, you're not going to get them all. You're going to be unlucky with some and you're going to be lucky with others. And as long as you have that mindset that actually a rejection does not mean that you're not right for the role, it might just be that you were unlucky, but at the same time stay attuned to the fact that it might mean you were not qualified for the role and you need more to do.
That's right.
For those listening to this who have perhaps themselves been candidates, are there any implications for them and what they can do differently in terms of handling those rejections?
First one is what we just spoke about, right? The idea that if you do understand the search process as a learning opportunity, and if you face rejection, you can use it as a chance to understand what your fit could be, and don't hesitate to ask recruiters for feedback. But I think there's also another side to keep in mind as a candidate, which is how you reject opportunities matters too. So it's not just when you're rejected, but when you reject opportunities. So I have found in my research that if you as a candidate are the one who is rejecting certain jobs or certain positions, the recruiters can actually react negatively to certain types of rejections from candidates. In this same study of around 10,000 executives, I found that candidates who turned down the search firm were less likely to be considered for future interviews. Candidates who had previously rejected an offer were almost 20% more likely to be rejected for an interview later on, but especially if they declined late in the process without giving good reasons, or they cited reasons that should have been clear from the start, like, for example, graphical constraints. You go through the motions of going through the search process, and at the very end said, I cannot move to France. But you knew from the beginning that you couldn't move to France, right? This was something that recruiters reacted to quite negatively, right? So what are the implications? Implications are if you are being considered for a position that you are unlikely to accept, it is crucial to set these clear expectations from the beginning. And as you learn more about the job, be upfront about any concerns or reasons that why you might not take it. Because ultimately, if you decide that you're going to decline it, it's important to be transparent on your side as well to minimize any negative impact on the future relationship for the search firm and the hiring firm. So I guess it goes both ways.
Are there any further implications beyond the hiring process that you see for board members to think about around how individuals respond to rejection? Yeah, so one of them is this idea of diversity, right? If we know that minorities, in particular, I look at gender, but I would imagine this is also the case for other minorities. If they are going to be more attuned to the fairness of the process because of their own experiences in the past, then you need to actually be very aware of that. Because, for example, if you're trying to increase diversity in your hires, you need to be very mindful of how you handle rejections. Sometimes what companies do is, let's just add more women to the candidate pool. Let's just put a lot of women there, right? But then if you're going to reject them without a fair and transparent process, it actually can backfire in the long run because they will be less likely to be willing to engage in the future. So you need to think about the following steps of how rejection might be perceived by different groups and how it's going to affect diversity. So that would be one. And another one, which is a bit more subtle, but actually I think is important, is that negative experiences in the recruitment process can spill over into other aspects of the candidate's relationship with a firm. For example, I found in my research that executives who felt unfairly rejected by a search firm, they were not only less likely to engage with that firm as candidates in the future, but they were also less likely to hire that firm as clients, right? To use that firm's services as clients. And there is not a lot of research on this, but there are some initial indication that companies that poorly manage the rejection process can also suffer reputational and business consequences down the line. Mostly on this, I have some anecdotal evidence of students or people I see going through recruitment processes in which the companies didn't treat them in a way that they thought it was fair when they rejected them. And then in the future, even years down the road, they will refuse to hire the services of that firm because of how they treated them. So this is actually something which might have important consequences. We haven't quantified what those are, but they certainly exist. Let's talk about gender diversity some more. I'm curious to hear, what do you see as the most common organizational barriers to gender diversity that board members listening to this need to know about?
So generally, I like to think of diversity as the representation of women across all levels of an organization. And the most common problem I've seen is that while there are enough women initially at the entry levels, their numbers decrease as we move up the hierarchy, and definitely at the boardroom. And there are many factors that contribute to this problem. So what helps me is to try to categorize the explanations into two main types, which we call the supply side and the demand side. So if you think about the supply side, this could be factors related to candidates' preferences or behavior. For example, one might think that women might be less willing to compete for certain opportunities. And this could be due to preferences, as we were discussing, or it could be constraints, such as family responsibilities or any other thing. And then you also have the demand side, which in contrast has to do with organizational practices that either directly or inadvertently discriminate women's progress or put obstacles on women's progress. So what I think is important for people to understand is that viewing these two types of explanations in isolation oversimplifies the issue. In order to make progress in removing barriers to gender diversity, we need to understand how these supply side and demand side factors interact, which is the discussion we were just having on what does it mean for women to be more sensitive to rejection, quote unquote. For example, I have found also the research that women are less likely than men to apply for top management and board positions. If you look at the data, they are less likely. And often the immediate response is to, okay, let's just fix the women. We're assuming that not applying because maybe they are risk averse or they're not competitive enough. So then what we have to do is we have to encourage them to apply, right? So we act on the supply side. However, the evidence actually suggests that women often do not apply because they may anticipate discrimination. They say, I'm not going to even bother because I'm not going to get the job. Whether that's the case or not, it might not be, but they might believe so because of their experiences or because they do not feel that they would belong in the organization. And it's important to realize that people are not imagining these messages. For senior women in particular who have been around for many years, these interpretations are the result of many situations where firms indeed did discriminate or they did not present themselves as attractive options, perhaps because of their organizational culture or something like that. So if you want to make progress in understanding these barriers to gender diversity, you need to understand these interactions between the behavior of women as applicants and the firm's behavior. And I think it's important for boards to be aware of this. It's a very simple point, but I think it's important because it's very important as well to question overly simplistic interpretations of the problem because they will lead you to overly simplistic solutions. But if you don't see these interactions, you might actually be doing more damage than helping.
So if you're sitting on a board, this could be a huge value lever, an opportunity for your organization if you can unlock some of these barriers. What would you do if you were sitting on a board for the first time to start to figure out whether these barriers exist in the organization you're on that someone listening to this might be able to do themselves as a board member?
Yeah, so this is very straightforward. After many years of research on gender inequality, one thing I have learned is that just gathering the right data is absolutely crucial. Again, very obvious, but surprisingly, many organizations skip this step. And then this leads to misunderstandings or assumptions about the specific barriers that they face. Because the barriers that you face in an organization may not be the same as those faced in other organizations. They're not all the same everywhere. So it's very important to first ask whether there is an equal representation of men and women in the firm, and if so, where it comes from. This is where asking the right questions can make a big difference. You need to know where to look and you need to do it systematically. And in my experience, there are two main areas that you need to investigate, which is hiring and then promotion and retention. And I think it helps if you think of these processes as a funnel with several stages where inequality may arise at different points. For example, in hiring, research often shows that if men and women are called for an interview, they're actually very often equally likely to get the job. The inequality tends to come from the fact that women might be less likely to apply for certain jobs, as we just said, right? So organizations should ask, why is this happening? Are we receiving a proportionate number of applications from women compared to the percentage of women in the industry? If not, why is that? Which messages are we sending them about the attractiveness of our company? Or it could be that in your organization, it might be the case that women are applying, but you are not selecting them. If so, why? And the solutions are going to depend on where in the process the inequality arises. And the same is for promotion, right? For promotion or retention, you can only draw conclusions if you know where in the funnel the problem lies. This is the first step, but I think applying this funnel framework can help us to diagnose gender diversity issues because once you know where the blocks are, then you need to figure out why and how to address them. But I think it's very common for organizations, and I would imagine for boards as well, to make assumptions about what is driving women away from organizations. But in my experience, those assumptions are not always correct. So you need to make sure that managers can show you data, pinpointing exactly where the problem is and how they have evaluated the various reasons for that problem. And you can quantify that with key metrics such as application rates, interview selection rates, promotion rates, broken down by gender, compared with benchmarks in the industry. You can conduct surveys and interviews with qualitative insights into why these disparities exist. Really, it's all about a data-driven approach, I believe. You just have to have the right data.
And so when you say the right data, practically speaking, for that board member listening to this now, think, okay, I need to get the right data. Is it to encourage the management to show me surveys? Is that what it is? Is it?
Well, I mean, it's surprising to me how many organizations, if you ask them, okay, how many people do you hire a year? How many of those are women? How many applied? How many did not apply? How many could have applied? Just give me numbers step by step, right? And just by having those numbers, you can already see where the problem is. Let's imagine that we have 30% of our application pool were women, right? But in the industry, there are 50% women. Why are we getting only 30%? Or let's imagine that, we got 30% women, but then we only interviewed 15%. Why? Is this because these women were not qualified or because our process was biased? Just simply give me the numbers. I want to know at each step how many there are, how many continued, why, what are the reasons, and so on and so forth. I don't think a lot of organizations actually do that. So it could be just like the HR data with very clear. And then if you can also try to dig deeper into why with surveys or with interviews or things like that. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. There seems to be an underlying assumption in many organizations that you'd expect things to come out in a 50-50 mix if everything is working well. And some of the research I've come across, would suggest that on average, women are better at collaborating than men. And let's say you've got roles in your organization or pipeline, or you have an organization where collaboration is absolutely critical. You'd expect there to be a higher proportion of women than men coming through that pipeline. And I suppose the question I'm trying to get to is, how do you work out what the right benchmark is for those? Because actually, if you're benchmarking against other organizations, that's just a relative thing. They could all be wrong as well. Is that something you've ever looked at? Because presumably, if an organization's getting this wrong and they're trying to improve and correct, there's a risk that they could overcorrect, or how do they know when they've reached their target?
I think that's a very hard question. I don't think I have a good answer. I would answer for that. Generally, when I look at benchmarking, I would look at the proportion of women in the potential candidate pool that are equally qualified to do this role and that exists, right? So it would be very unrealistic to say that a mining company should have 50% top management women, because there is just not enough in the market in that industry. So the best that you can do is to have a bit more than whatever the proportion of women in that industry are, right? So that's how I've been looking at benchmarking. Generally, from the perspective of research, I tend not to make assumptions about intrinsic differences in attitudes or collaboration or something like that, but just look at on the paper qualifications of people. Everything else being equal, are you hiring the same amount of men and women? Everything else being equal in terms of what they're bringing to the table. Yes, I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer than that.
That's reassuring to hear. If you as an expert don't have a clear view on that, then it's reassuring that, to me at least, that it stumps me completely.
At least for me, I don't think there is a right answer of this is the percentage of people of certain demographics that we should have. I think that the way I look at it is more, if people are coming to me with equal qualifications, am I making sure that those people are being treated equally, right? And then the target will work out itself if you are making sure that people are treated equally. And treated equally, I don't mean just treated equally in terms of in the interview, but also before. What messages are you sending to people of different demographic groups about how they would fit in this organization? What would be the environment for them to thrive in, and so on and so forth, right? If you are making sure that equally qualified people feel that they could fit there, then whether that's 30% or 50%, I don't know. And in some contexts, 30% might be a really good number. And in others, if you have 60%, it might not be that good. It's just about equal opportunity, really, for me.
That's where it becomes so challenging, because when you talk about qualifications there, what exactly are you referring to? I guess if I have two people who've both got an accountancy qualification, they could be very different in other dynamics that might might be really important to that particular board role if they're going for an audit chair role. One is very curious and the other is very fixed mindset, dogmatic. And actually what I want for my audit chair role is someone who's very curious, who's going to come and really ask good questions. So when you look at those qualifications, what are you looking at exactly? And how do you know that they are capturing the full spectrum of what's required for those roles?
I do not. That's where the fit comes in. And I do think that those would be qualifications that the people who are hiring should be really aware of. But it's because you are very careful at Neural at the hiring process, we need to be very sure that those are actual qualifications rather than preferences or chemistry or taste, right? So is it really the case that curiosity, however we define it, and then you define it, right? How do we know this person is more curious? Is it really the case that this is the thing that fits the role? And if it's the role, how can we measure it and so on and so forth? So that's a qualification. And it's on the recruiter to know whether they are measuring it correctly, but they do need to be aware that is this really a requirement of the role, or is it that I just like people who play golf or play? So it just has to be very systematic. You have to set the requirements of the job, and then you have to be very careful that you treat people who could do the job similarly. And then, yes, you decide curiosity or however it is that we define it is important for the role. Are we really making sure that this particular person is more curious, or is it just our perception because they look like me?
Let's talk about professional relationships. You've done a lot of work on the topic of professional relationships, and I'm curious to hear, why is this relevant for a board member to be aware of the organization's relationships?
Right. There are different types of relationships that we might be referring to when we talk about organization's relationship. Or it could be external relationship with competitors, with suppliers, with the government, or it could be internal relationships, maybe among different divisions and key people within the organization. So let me just focus on those, on the internal relationships. And by relationships, informal relationships, not necessarily what the organizational chart says the relationship should be. So you can think of the formal organizational chart as the hardware of how the organization works, but informal relationships are the software. And they don't always overlap, which I think is an interesting thing, right? Just because the chart says two groups should be communicating and trusting each other doesn't mean they do, and vice versa. So I think understanding these overlaps or the lack of overlaps is very important, because very often they are behind many organizational problems. A lack of innovation could be due to what sociologists call too much closure, which means that people within departments or divisions, maybe they're communicating only with people within their group and they're not reaching out to external parties. And we know from a lot of research that new ideas and innovation typically emerge from interactions with diverse groups, rather than always talking with the same people, the same circle. Or another problem might be that there is a lack of success in implementing strategic initiatives. And often this is due to the fact that there are organizational silos where parts of the organization that should be collaborating, they really are not. So I think that it's very important to understand how the organization functions, and boards should care about this, because strong internal relationships can help innovation, they can improve teamwork, and ultimately that should help the organization perform better, I think.
How does one as a board member go about that? Because I love the idea that I could have a snapshot showing, look, the organization has a fundamental misalignment between strategic goals and the relationships required to deliver those and what's actually happening. How have you seen organizations best grasp this and represent this for those on the board?
There are a couple of things one can look at. Metrics related to collaboration and also network analysis, right? So these are meant to measure how well teams are working together and how information flows to the organization. So for collaboration metrics, one can collect data from project management tools and collaboration software, for example, for Slack or Microsoft Teams. And it can give you information on communication frequency, project participation, task completion rates. And what kind of metrics would you look at? You could look at things like frequency of interactions to understand patterns of communication across departments. For example, are certain teams frequently in touch while others are isolated? Or you could look at response times. One can measure how quickly teams respond to each other's requests, right? For example, faster response times often indicate better working relationships, more efficient collaboration. And then one thing that organizations are starting to use quite a lot, I'm seeing, is network analysis, which is the idea of mapping out the informal relationships and the communication patterns within the organization. There are companies that will do this kind of analysis for you. They can collect survey data from employees on their most important relationships at work, or more directly, they can use data on email exchange, Slack, Slack, Teams. And with this data, you can understand the structure of the informal network of relationships. It's actually very straightforward with some software. You can look at things like network density, which will measure the number of actual connections relative to the number of potential possible connections. You could look at who are the key influencers in the network. So these might be people who the organizational charts say that they are influencers, but actually they might not be, because the informal relationships, who they are emailing, the Slack and all these things, it can give you a sense of who are the people who are the most connected. You can identify whether there are clusters or silos. And you can do this with data. It's actually not very difficult to do, to use this with the data that we have right now available, that organizations have. This kind of network analysis can help boards better understand how effectively different parts of the organizations are working together and do it in a data-driven way.
Is this data-driven approach superior to that gut feel that someone might say they would pick up from walking the shop floor? I certainly hear a number of non-execs who say you just got to get out there and walk amongst the team and you'll pick this sort of thing up. What would you say to that person that they're risking? Are they at risk of missing something there, of relying on their system one thinking versus system two thinking in Daniel Kahneman's language?
I'm a firm believer in data. I do think it's important to go out to the floor and talk to people. I do think that's very important, but I don't think that's a substitute for actually collecting the actual information, because there is also a lot of evidence that suggests that people are very bad at perceiving the network. We tend to believe that we are more central than we actually are. There's a lot of evidence that suggests that people don't read the informal network very well. In fact, people who are in positions of power, they're even worse at reading this, because they don't have to, right? Because people do the things that you tell them to do, or they pretend to do the things that you tell them to do. And for people in top management, and I suppose on boards, although I don't know of specific research on boards for this, it's very easy to assume that whatever they say people should be doing, that's what they are doing, right? And in fact, when you look at the data, it might not be. So yes, I would tell people, do both. Collect the data and check that the data actually matches or doesn't match your gut feeling.
What are the ways in which relationships are influencing career outcomes that would be most surprising to our listeners?
I think there are a couple. One, it might still be surprising for some people, is that relationships can affect your career through what we call weak ties. So a lot of us assume that our closest friends and colleagues are very important to obtain career-related help. But research shows that it's actually those more casual acquaintances, the people that you don't talk to all the time, that can be super valuable. And because these weak ties often bring in fresh information and opportunities that your immediate circle might miss. Again, looking beyond your closer network. For example, a casual LinkedIn connection might tip you off about a job opening or introduce you to someone important in your industry. So that is one. Another one, which I think is quite interesting, is what we call dormant ties. And these are people you used to be close with, but you have not interacted with in a while. It might sound strange, but actually research shows that reconnecting with these people can be incredibly valuable. Let's say somebody you were very good friends in college, or a coworker that you haven't spoken with in 5 years, but you were very close. It's not that you fell off or anything. You just happen to lose touch. And because you used to have a strong bond, there is already that trust and that shared history. But because while you have been out of touch, they have had time to gather new experiences and insights that can be helpful. For instance, reaching out to an colleague or a friend might lead to fresh ideas, new opportunities. I usually encourage my students to reach out to people they have not spoken with in the last 3 years, but they used to have a good relationship with, and ask them for help on a project. And they don't like this, right? They're usually very nervous. They're like, oh, I'm going to go back to the people just right out of the blue to ask them for something. But once they do it, they find that these people, these dormant ties, they're not only helpful, but they're actually happy to be contacted and happy to catch up. And it almost always turns out to be a productive and pleasant experience. So I actually try to make myself every couple months to reach out to somebody who I haven't spoken with 2 or 3 years and just see how they're doing. And it's incredibly helpful. You never know what you're going to get. And it's also nice.
How can people identify which professional relationships are worth investing in and which aren't? Is there any data that would help guide people that you've come across?
So a lot of people think that they need to build relationships in a calculated way, strategize whom to meet, what to discuss. There is often this idea that we need to know in advance exactly what we want from each relationship that we build. And this sounds logical, but actually the best way to build professional relationships is by paradoxically forgetting about what you may get out of them and instead focusing on giving, on helping. So there's this professor at Wharton, Adam Grant, that you might be familiar with.
Givers, not takers.
Yeah, he talks about that, givers versus takers, right? Givers help others without keeping a score, while takers are always trying to look to maximize their own gain. And in fact, it turns out that givers tend to build more solid and lasting relationships because they create trust and goodwill. People remember it. So I think that rather than trying to establish relationships to get a job or a favor or figuring out who is the most important, the people who are going to make the most difference, I think it's important to try to connect with people on a deeper level, really to show genuine interest in their lives, offer support when they need it, and share your knowledge and resources without expecting anything back. Because really, I think that over time, these actions build a strong foundation of trust and mutual respect. And eventually, you end up creating meaningful connections and a network of people who are happy to support you. So yeah, I would not really even try to figure out who is the most strategic one. So you also don't know. We are very bad at perceiving what people can bring to the table. And in particular, we're very bad at perceiving who those people are tied with. You don't know. Like this person who might seem not that important now, turns out that 5 years from now might be the one who knows this person that you actually need to know, right? And you cannot know in advance. So you go around the world trying to figure it out in advance, you probably are just going to become too strategic and miss out a lot of opportunities. If you already know what you're going to get out of something, you don't learn anything.
That resonates. And Isabel, time is flying by, but before we go on to the lightning round, I want to quickly pick your brains on people analytics, which is another area of your deep expertise. It's an area that I'm deeply passionate about and have learned a lot about over the last couple of years, not least from you. I'm curious to hear where you see organizations most commonly going wrong with people analytics or missing the opportunity with people analytics. And perhaps you could just give your overview of, for those not familiar with people analytics, what you see as people analytics.
I mean, for people analytics, I just basically, what I mean is that using data to make decisions that are related to people in organizations, in terms of hiring, promotion, performance evaluations, these kind of things, and using hard data for this purpose. Statistical analysis, or it could be machine learning, it could be AI, but it could be just simply looking at the raw descriptives, as we said before, right? Just looking at data. And I think when you look at the ways in which organizations may go wrong with this approach, with people analytics, in my experience, it all has to do with what I like to call the data trap, which is one of the most common mistakes I see, and it plays out in different ways. First, there is the issue of collecting tons of data, but without really knowing what to do with it. And this is particularly so with the rise of big data and machine learning and AI. It is easier than ever to gather information, but if you do not have a clear plan for how you're using the data, it can end up being more of a burden than a help. You just have all this data, you don't know what to do with it, and people have to ask the questions before collecting the data. On the flip side, some organizations do not collect enough data, even though they collect a lot of data. It might surprise you, but there are still plenty of companies where senior leaders cannot easily get basic statistics about their workforce. They might not have a clear picture of things like employee demographics, performance metrics, who is at risk of leaving. It's so important stuff that they should have at their fingertips. Somebody might collect it in the IT department, but it never makes it to the leaders, right? And then there is the issue of collecting the wrong kind of data. For example, in hiring, companies often gather lots of detailed information on the people they hire, their demographic, their skills, their personality traits, but they do not keep a lot of data on the people they did not hire. And I know this is tricky because how much data you can keep on people, particularly these days, is difficult. But without making that comparison, it's really hard to figure out if your hiring process is working as well as it should. It's trying to solve a puzzle with half of the pieces missing. There is another issue, which is that organizations sometimes get caught up in using the latest AI solutions without really defining the problem they're trying to solve. And leaders need to be very clear about their goals, whether it's hiring the best talent, increasing diversity, reducing turnover. But very often companies just grab onto solutions that offer from external vendors that they don't really match their actual needs, right? It is like looking for problems to fit a solution rather than the other way around, right? People will sell you all sorts of stuff to do a network analysis of this, to do that. But is that really where your priorities should lie? And then there is the last one, which I actually think is very obvious, which we must not forget the human side of things. When we implement people analytic tools, for example, now these days, AI-based tools for recruitment, we need to be aware of how these are going to be perceived by the people in the organization. Let's say that we can have an algorithm that accurately predicts which candidates might perform well. But still, employees and job seekers might not always be comfortable with how those decisions are made. For example, coming back to the idea of rejection, if an algorithm rejects a candidate based on factors that seem opaque or unfair, it can lead to trust issues, to concerns about bias. So you need to think about fairness, transparency, and ethics when using these tools in recruitment. They're not just neutral tools, right? So in order to get people analytics right, in summary, organizations have to be thoughtful. They have to be intentional. It's not just about collecting the data. It's about collecting the right data, defining the problem, and making sure that the solutions are not just effective, but I think ethical. And I think the boards should be aware of these issues and monitor them to the best of their possibilities.
Are there any examples that come to mind where you think an organization has really got it wrong with the ethical question around analytics?
One of the things that happens sometimes is that organizations collect all this data and they don't tell people they're collecting data. And then when the employees find out, they are very upset. The truth is that organizations have the right to collect data. Legally, you can collect your employees' emails. You can do all sorts of network analysis in their email patterns and things like that. But ethically, you should tell people that you're doing that. And also in terms of privacy and transparency, I think it is important that this data is very sensitive. So it needs to be properly anonymized before it's being shown to whoever looks at it, the CEO or the board or anything like that. It's crucial that the employees know the data is collected, they understand the steps taken to protect their confidentiality. It very much depends on the organization's culture, really, right? And how they deal with this type of trust issues. So that I see quite often, actually.
Are there any examples that spring to mind as best practice in your mind? And are there characteristics that stand out amongst those organizations and how they approach?
So I think the organizations that are transparent, that they say, look, we're collecting this data on interactions. I've seen a few of those. And this is how we're using it. And we are not going to give information on specific individuals, right? We're not going to say John Smith in accounts is tied to this and that, but we're going to put it in the aggregate and they tell people, and then people are willing to volunteer. So that's one. I have also seen a couple of organizations doing a very good work around performance management and people analytics. This is slightly different from what we're talking about now, but they're very transparent about the kind of information that we are collecting to measure employees' performance. They tell people which information this is. They have committees that will monitor the way in which these performance evaluations are written. They will monitor them for bias, for accuracy. And AI can be very helpful for these kind of things. For example, to detect patterns in the way in which you speak about the performance of different groups of employees. Are you speaking differently, using different words, for example, for men versus women or people from certain ethnic groups? For the same level of objective, quote-unquote, performance, are you describing it differently? Because we know that bias seeps into these kind of things. So I've seen a couple of organizations that are very good at this. And they tell people this is what they're doing.
I really like that idea of the committee that acts as the sort of the API between the analytics and the people. That's something we've definitely done with our people analytics.
Yeah.
We have committee from different parts of the organization, and it provides a bridge that humanizes the insights coming out and builds trust with people that it's being used in a fair and useful way so that it's not just a machine.
Yeah, these are not numbers only. These are people issues. And you need somebody there in the middle who knows the business and knows the data, both things.
Isabel, time has flown, which means it's time for the lightning round where I'm going to say a short statement and ask you for a quick response if you're ready.
Okay.
Favorite book?
I'm very boring because I don't have a favorite book. But I normally don't read nonfiction for pleasure. Most of what I read is fiction. And really, most of what I read to switch off in vacation is science fiction. So I read a lot of science fiction, particularly the classics.
Favorite quote?
Not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted.
Most significant professional insight?
It's a very simple one, really. I remember my dissertation advisor always telling me, it's a marathon, not a sprint, and there are not shortcuts to knowledge.
Worst professional advice you've ever received?
Cut your hair down. Yes. More seriously, I was indeed told to cut my hair so it wouldn't be distracting when I was teaching. I did not do it. But most generally, I got a lot of advice early on in my career on how to adapt my research and teaching to what other people would like and to see the answers they would like to hear and how I behaved. You have to be discerning with this advice.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time?
I have come to realize that boards are more interesting than I used to believe. I was not particularly interested in boards and their dynamics until I started to work on a project on FTSE 100 boards and learn more about the context. And then I realized that boards are not only important on their own, but they can help us understand some more general social and organizational dynamics in interesting ways. And now I'm very interested in boards.
When was the last time you got a significant judgment call wrong, and what did you learn?
I've got many things wrong, but I tend to remember mistakes in hiring processes, probably because that's what I study. In particular, there have been a couple of occasions when I was completely convinced that we should not hire somebody, but I was overruled. We hired them, and that person turned out to be fantastic. Okay. Or worse yet, a couple of cases when I was not overruled, we did not hire the person, and then turned out to be fantastic, but somewhere else, right? So I'm now experienced enough to take my strong opinions on hiring and on many other things for that matter with a grain of salt, and much more careful to ensure that we follow processes that we know work rather than relying on intuition and gut feeling.
How are you better today as a board member than when you started?
I am not on any boards myself, and I was only on the board of a charity where I did not last for very long. What I learned was that it's very important to understand why you have been brought to that board, because in my case, I thought I had been brought for my expertise and my critical thinking. And then when I did raise criticisms, it became clear that those were not necessarily welcome. That was not why I was there. And I should have been much more careful when deciding to take that role, to ask questions about what my position would be, what were they expecting for me. And I think it just highlights the importance of the matching process and understanding the fit between the board and the director or the trustee.
Finally, 3 things our listeners should take away from this podcast if they take nothing else.
Rejection matters. Make sure that you do it properly. Although board diversity is important, it is even more important that boards help remove barriers to diversity in the rest of the organization. And mistakes due to using less than perfect data are not as bad as those due to not using data at all.
Isabel, I love bridging the academic and commercial worlds. Thank you so much for sharing your deep expertise, which spans both of those. I'm sure our listeners will have found that hugely thought-provoking and valuable.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This was fun.
If you found this conversation interesting and would like to be involved in similar discussions, join the New Role Board community. Community membership gives you access to 24-hour discussion threads on boardroom challenges and opportunities like those we've been discussing. Smart online networking events, one-to-one career sessions with our headhunters, third-party board roles, mastermind groups, and Q&As with senior board members. Head to community.newrole.com to find out more.